last week's program, I spoke about an upcoming bill in the United States Senate that was ostensibly designed to help community banks, but was really helping to enable discrimination and also some of the largest banks as well. We talked about that. We had an interview with David Dayen about it. And this week, or the other day, that bill passed in the United States Senate. Here to talk about that with us now is Alexis Goldstein. Alexis has been on the program before. I've been following her for years. She is wise and insightful on financial reform. She is now what's her title? Senior Policy Analyst at Americans for Financial Reform, or AFR, which is a nonpartisan coalition of over 200 groups working to create or ensure a safe and ethical financial system. So first of all, Alexis, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks so much for having me, RJ. It's good to be here.
Good to have you. And secondly, that safe and ethical financial system, how's that working out?
You know, it's been a tough year,
Yeah.
But we will keep fighting. And, you know, hope springs eternal. But yeah, this week was a rough week.
It was a rough week, but before we get to the specifics of the bill, I do want to say one of the discussions that's been going on now is online and elsewhere is, you know, it seems like the banks have all the levers of power right now. As we're about to discuss, they have many friends in the Democratic Party as well as a kind of stranglehold. The Republican Party is basically a wholly owned subsidiary now. And so they have the lobbyists and they have the money and all of that. On the other hand, I feel with your organization and others that there's more activism against the big banks than there's been at any point. I mean, we had Occupy, but at this point there are more groups working to reform the financial system and push back than ever before. So I guess that's kind of a sign for some hope. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that's right. And I also think that, you know, we've done polling for a long time at Americans for Financial Reform about just, do people want more or less rules on Wall Street? And every time we do this polling, the answer is the same. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, people want more rules on Wall Street, not less. But I think the other thing that is really exciting about this fight over this bill that just passed, and obviously that's a loss, but we saw a whole number of groups really engaged in this. Groups like Indivisible, which didn't really exist prior to the 2016 election. We saw, you know, folks from like Pod Save America, which are sort of these ex-Obama guys, but they have a really big following. They were talking about it. They were telling their listeners about it. You know, obviously we saw Move On activate their folks on this. We saw Root Strikers, and then all the folks that are normally engaged on this were engaged on it, right? AFR, the Center for Responsible Lending, the National Consumer Law Center, all those groups like that. But I definitely agree with you that it does seem like, you know, even more than before, lots of people are engaged on this issue. Lots of people are angry about what happened, and backlash is going to be really important to make sure that they don't keep doing this sort of deregulation. But I'm certainly grateful to all the people who did put up a fight about this. And my Twitter has certainly been blowing up in the wake of this. People are genuinely angry, and I see that through the engagement with the groups, but I also just see it out on social media. And so that's always a good sign in terms of pushing for things going forward.
And I guess when we think about a theory of change for fighting back on all this, and I know you guys are nonpartisan, a lot of people have, well, some people have said to me, I did a piece on the $24 million that 16 Democratic senators got from the banking world, the 16 who voted for this bill. They voted on a procedural vote a few days ago and then for its passage. And, you know, some people have said to me, well, why are you beating up on Democrats? The fact is all the Republicans are in the tank for this bill. And that's true. And I guess the question becomes, anyone who voted for this bill, Republican or Democrat, should be hammered for it. But I guess what I think, too, is when one party, doesn't matter which one it is, in this case it's the Democrats, when one party has a division, I want to help the people who want to do the right thing and punish the people who did the wrong thing, even if it's just with a moment's bad press. I feel that's how you discourage. There's always going to be the temptation of campaign contributions and so on. It's hard to overcome that, but at least if they know they get pushback, maybe they'll think twice next time. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think, yes, I agree with you. I would also throw out there that the Republicans needed Democrats to pass this bill. This was a bill that needed 60 votes, at least, to pass. They got 67. And so whether you can have the argument as an individual member, do you support deregulating the banks or not? If you do support it, it does still seem like a moment where you should have demanded something in exchange, right? The Republicans are very good at this. Like when the Freedom Caucus was, challenging, when the Democrats were in power over and over again over things like breaching the debt ceiling and, just funding the government. Obviously, that's something you should just do, right? You shouldn't pick a fight over it. But they made this decision that they wanted to extract a pound of flesh in exchange for something that they ostensibly wanted. And since the Democrats have so few points of leverage, I would sort of argue that this strategically, politically was a bad choice because they just did it without really asking for anything at all. So even if you believed in this bill wholeheartedly, which of course I do not, and I don't think anyone else should, but even if you did, it seems like it was a strategic mistake. And the other thing is, you mentioned the 24 million that the Democrats who supported this bill received. It's not as if their support for this bill is going to make sure that no bank is going to contribute to their opponent, their Republican opponent, right? The banks are probably going to still contribute to the campaign of these Democrats' Republican opponents in the 2018 races, for those of them that are up. So I also feel like they're not really getting that much out of their support. And so that's the other reason I think just strategically it's a mistake. But I certainly think that they wanted to do something bipartisan. That's the best assessment I can make for why some of these Democrats did what they did. But I definitely agree with you. This is a sort of a question about where the Democratic Party wants to be on economic issues. And you will notice that none of the folks who are sort of named regularly as 2020 presidential contenders, right, like Warren, Sanders, Murphy, Klobuchar, all of that, Booker, Gillibrand, Harris, all of them were opposed to this bill. So there's sort of this interesting, red state Dems who are up in 2018 versus those who are seeking the 2020 nomination. There was like a big split about how those folks voted. And the folks seeking the Democratic nomination for president, none of them supported this.
Of course, they didn't need them for passage. So sometimes senators do sit down and decide who gets a pass and who doesn't, but I don't know if that happened in this case or not. In any case, Alexis Goldstein of Americans for Financial Reform, let's talk about what's in the bill. What did, first of all, our listeners should know it's passed the United States Senate, but it needs to go back to the House now for reconciliation, I guess, because it does not square up with what the House has previously passed. Is that right?
That's right, and there's actually a chance that the House will blow it up because Jeb Hensarling, who is the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, is known as being this very sort of extreme libertarian type who demands all sorts of things. And so he could potentially blow this whole thing up by saying, I will only accept this if you attach these 10 other bills to it, and the senators have said, no, you can't attach anything else to it. I do think that there will be pressure on him to concede. I think the question is, will he? So we actually don't know if this is going to pass or not, although I think he will see a lot of pressure to give up and just accept the bill as it is so that they can get on with it.
So the best hope for this not passing is a person with, in my opinion, horrible ideas, perhaps standing on principle, but it's unlikely. Yeah. But it's unlikely because there's going to be a lot of money coming his way. It sounds like another case of, as is so often the case nowadays, our best hope lies in the fact that Republicans so often do, and their allies in the other parties, so often do bad things badly. Right, that's right. So, and it's the case here as well. So this bill, essentially, as I mentioned in the introduction, Alexis, it is set up as helping community banks, and everybody likes community banks. Community banks are more likely to do favorable the kinds of lending people like you and I would like to see. They are based in the community. They're not the monoliths who have a distortionary effect on the political process with their contributions at the same level as the mega banks do. They don't pose a systemic threat. And this was supposedly, they keep telling us, the quisling Democrats and the Republicans keep telling us, well, this just relieves the regulatory burden on community banks. But I think that's my assessment, you tell me if I'm wrong, is that that's a two-part falsehood. One is that it largely, what it relieves is not necessarily a burden, and secondly, many of its benefits go to banks that are not at all what we think of as community banks.
Yes, I agreed on both counts. So this is not a community bank bill. Community banks already are not subject to the kind of rules that they just rolled back, so long as they are less than $50 billion in assets. And that is what I think of as a community bank. A community bank is not a bank that's $200 billion in assets. So what this bill does is, it used to be if you were above $50 billion, you got these extra standards by the Fed. You got extra monitoring, more frequent stress tests. They, were allowed to make sure you weren't operating with too much debt. So this bill raises by 5 that threshold. So instead of being $50 billion and up, it's $250 billion and up. And I don't know about you, but I don't think a bank that's $249 billion, which is almost $250 billion, that's not a community bank. That's a very large bank. That's a BB&T. That's a Capital One. That's an M&T. That's a Regions. That's a U.S. bank. That's, that's a large bank. So. Right. And I should say that this is 25 out of the 38 largest banks in the country. These are banks that have stadiums named after them. And then sort of to your other point, to the extent that it does impact community banks, but the rules are important. So after the last financial crisis, we saw a lot of discrimination in lending. We saw a lot of banks targeting communities of color and giving Black and Latino borrowers subprime or really bad mortgages when a white person who had the same credit score, the same income level, got much better terms on their mortgage, even though they both had the same financial condition. It was just a question of what race they were. And so one of the things they did is they said, okay, banks, you have to give us some extra information so we can catch you when you do this kind of discrimination in lending. And they said, we need credit scores and we need other information like loan terms. This bill would say that basically 85% of banks and credit unions no longer have to report that. And so, look, if you're a community bank doing discrimination in lending, that's an important thing that they shouldn't be doing. And you shouldn't be able to get away with it just because you're, a quote-unquote community bank. So that's another thing that this bill would do. And it does still exempt, if you give out less than 50 mortgages a year, you don't have to do this reporting, but this bill would raise that threshold up to 500. And so there's a lot more banks. 85% of banks would now no longer have to do that reporting, and that's a really bad thing. And, the academic Adam Levitin, he's a professor at Georgetown Law School, he said that this bill will facilitate more racial discrimination in lending.
Well, and that's, and in terms of the burden aspect of it, you come out of the technology world. I did tech work. You did it specifically in the banking sector. You've got to keep this information, even if you're a community bank. So there's no administrative burden. It's just a matter of writing a program to pull that data and submit it to the feds to show whether or not you're being racist and or conceivably sexist, I imagine, in your lending practices, right?
Right. Yeah, you need credit score in order to determine if you're going to give someone a loan or not. So it's not like they're not collecting this information.
Right.
It's just a matter of then sending it to the regulators.
And you also collect, I assume, racial and gender information. You certainly collect geography information.
Yeah. The new rules were actually, so they already had to report on race. The new rules were like, we also need credit score. We also need the loan terms so that they could see if somebody was discriminating just on the basis of race, right? If you have the same credit score. But yeah, everything that they need, they already have, they already collect. So they just, banks tend to ask for rules to be relaxed when they can.
Well, particularly when it could show them behaving in an unlawful or immoral manner. I was just looking at a report published by the Urban Institute, women talking about discriminatory practices against women in mortgages, published in September 2016, that explicitly states it relied on this data. So So I guess now maybe that relied on the required reporting data. So anything that liberalizes that reporting, I would say, is hurting women as well. Fair statement?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I mean, it could hurt anyone, right? Any kind of prejudice you can imagine in mortgage lending could get worse here because we just are going to have less data, and that's a bad thing.
So yes, indeed. So have we covered all the key aspects, all the essential badness of this bill, or have we
I would
overlooked
add
something?
one more thing, which is that this also deregulates very large foreign banks. So basically, if you are a giant foreign bank but you have a U.S. presence, if your U.S. presence is 200 billion or 150 billion, and pretty much most of them are, you are also deregulated by this bill. So this bill doesn't just deregulate, big U.S. banks. This deregulates Deutsche Bank. This deregulates Santander, who's gotten into a lot of hot water because they've been doing all this subprime auto lending. And there's, UBS is a serial offender. They, manipulating interest rates and all sorts of things. Credit Suisse, right, like hiding Americans' money overseas and helping them dodge taxes. All of those banks are also deregulated by this bill. So it's sort of interesting. It's like, we have Trump out here talking about, oh, I'm going to be tough on other countries with all these tariffs. But it's almost like he doesn't have any idea what Mitch McConnell is doing over here, deregulating all these giant foreign banks.
Or he doesn't care.
Right, right. Or both.
And either way, Democrats should not be helping him and his minions do their evil work. So unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. But Alexis Goldstein, Senior Policy Analyst with the Americans for Financial Reform, thanks for all the great work you guys do, and thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me.